Welcome back, everyone. Now before we get started sculpting, I want to show you the two methods of sculpting that are available to you in Blender. We're only going to be using one of them, but I want to show you both options so that you can make your own decision. So, if you expand this window and go over to the Modifiers tab, the first method that I'll be covering will be the Multi-Resolution modifier. So you go to Add Modifier, and you go to Multi-Resolution. Now you don't see any change now. That's because we have to go from Object Mode down here and change it to Sculpt Mode. Now, once we're in Sculpt Mode, you can start sculpting on your mesh here. So you see we have different brushes. We have the F-blob, the clay strips, F-crease, fill, deepen, flatten, grab, inflate, layer, mask, nudge, pinch, rotate, scrape, regular sculpt draw, which is the brush I selected now, smooth, snake hook, and F-thumb. We're only going to be using a few of these really. And the default brush that you start off with is the sculpt draw. So what you do is you just click and drag on the mesh, and you see you start manipulating it. However, you can see that we're changing a lot of broad detail, like we're not adding any fine details. That's where the multi-resolution modifier comes in. So what you do is you click subdivide, and now you see when we sculpt, and you see it, we're on sculpt 1 and render 1. You see when we sculpt now, we're sculpting a bit more finer detail. We can actually see the indentations of what we're doing a bit easier. Then we hit subdivide again. You see all that smooths out, and then you can make even finer adjustments. When we subdivide it again, even finer, subdivide it again, and you can keep going. However, the downfall of this is that if I get real close and sculpt, you see that it can't, in order to get that fine of detail, I have to subdivide pretty high. So that's 5 subdivisions there. And even so, it's still not as fine as I'd like it to be. And if you keep subdividing your mesh like this, eventually you'll run out of computing power, and it's actually very taxing on your machine. You can sculpt like this, and what the advantage of this is that if I tab into edit mode, you see that the mesh hasn't, the default of the mesh hasn't changed. The actual geometry is still the same. However, we have all these details and stuff in our sculpted layers. So that's one of the advantages of sculpting like this. You don't have to do any retopology, but it's real taxing on your machine, and in order to get real fine details, you have to subdivide to a fairly high degree. So, I do not use this method. The method I use is called dynamic topology. And so, what is that? So, make sure your T panel is open. If it's not, just hit the letter T and it'll be open. Now, scroll down to where it says dynamic topology. And again, you can only see these menus when you're in sculpt mode. Make sure you're in sculpt mode. So, if I click enable Dyne Topo, you see everything changes to triangles. However, when I start moving around, you see I'm messing with the fine detail. If I get closer, I can mess with even more detail. If I get closer than that, I can just keep going. So the cool thing about dynamic topology is that it gives you more freedom to sculpt whatever you want without confining you to a set level of geometry at a certain stage. Thing is, it destroys your mesh completely. This is not an animator ready mesh. You would have to retopologize this and use the normal map for what you sculpted in order to get the details that you want and still have a animator ready 3D model. So I prefer this method because it enables me to have more freedom when I sculpt, and retopologizing is just a part of the process. You retopologize when you make games, movies, all kind of stuff. You're gonna have to learn it eventually, and like I said, the other method is useful, but it's like an escape from what you'll eventually end up doing. So we're going to be using this method, and so now let's jump into it. So we're going to start sculpting the upper torso. So let's go here and let's lower the opacity of our background image a little bit. Let me go on the front view, and in fact we don't need it right now. In fact, we don't need these front and side images anymore, because we're going to sculpt this in perspective mode. So in order to go from orthographic to perspective, just hit 5 on the keyboard, or not the keyboard, but on the number pad. Alright, so now we're in perspective mode. So we're going to start sculpting with dynamic topology. So right click on this mesh, make sure that this is the one outlined, and we're going to go to sculpt mode, and then we're going to hit dynamic topology. Alright, but before we change it to dynamic topology, apply the mirror modifier. Now enable it. So you see everything is triangles like we discussed earlier. Make sure that x-axis mirror is turned on in the symmetry menu, and I start off with clay strips. To do this tutorial with you all, I'm actually using a mouse to sculpt. I am not sculpting with a tablet. Just to show you all that you do not need a tablet to be good at sculpting. You can use a mouse. I've used a mouse for most of, if not all of my sculpting. I know I've used the tablet before. I bought it for the specific reason of sculpting, and it's just I feel more comfortable with a mouse, honestly. So no, that's a bit weird to hear. So just click and drag, and add some of that detail there. I'm gonna smooth that out, and I'm gonna add some of that chest detail here. So in order to invert, so right now we're adding on to the geometry when we click and drag. But what if I want to indent some geometry? So what we can do is hit Control and hold Control, and then we'll click, and you see now instead of adding it on top of each other, we're pushing it in like that. That's what we want. So just for that particular part, we want to push that in there. So we're going to start off, we're going to start off with a detail size of 12, and then we're going to work our way down from there. So the way this works, you start sculpting at what seems to be a higher, what you would consider a higher detail resolution, but actually in order to be able to sculpt finer details, you would lower this number instead of increase it. So we're starting at 12 now, and then we'll decrease it later when we want to add finer muscle details. Okay. Just try to stay as broad as possible. Don't worry about the neck area right now. We'll worry about that later when we make the head model. Okay, start adding in some of the geometry for the abdomen, for these muscles that come in here. Use Control to make indentations rather than add on detail. Okay. Again, you do not need a tablet. You can use a mouse because I'm using a mouse. And so don't feel pressured to, in order to follow this tutorial, to go out and buy a expensive tablet, because you don't need it. Anyone can follow along with this with a mouse. And they can follow along pretty well because yours truly is also using a mouse. Okay, let's going into the back here. Get some of that in. So let's sculpt this area in the lower back. Okay, so it's like a muscle, a real big muscle comes in here, goes down like that. Now let's get these deltoids a bit bigger. I suggest you go look at some reference images for anatomy to better follow along. I actually loaded some anatomy pictures in the background, not the background, but the in Google. I'm gonna show you. So I'm just looking at some pictures of the backs here. So that's always good to have when you're sculpting a character with, you know, muscle showing. You always want to have some reference to look back on. So this part is what I'm sculpting right now. So we can come back and we see it comes like that. So we see that the deltoid flows kind of under that, or part of the deltoid anyway. So all right, now, so you start drawing with the mouse button, but let's say you want to smooth something out. Like, let's say you do not like you say you make a detail right here. Whoops, you don't like it. You can hit Control Z to get rid of it, or you can do that, and then you can hold Shift, and Shift automatically checks or automatically activates the smooth function. So when you hold Shift and click, you see when I click, it changes to smooth. Okay? So keep that in mind when you're making your adjustments. You don't have to click on this and then click smooth and then regularly click. You can stay with clay strips and hold Shift and, you know, click down, and that'll smooth out your errors. Alright, so I'm going to start making the tricep. So the inside of this part right here, this part is generally bigger than this part. So that's what I'm making right now. Okay, just some clarity. This part comes all the way down to here. Alright, so this is an area where I would want to hold Shift and click down to smooth it. There we go. Just to show you that particular tool in a real situation. Okay. Alrighty. So we're still in we're still with 12 details. We're not going any lower yet. We're still getting the muscles mapped out and everything. We're not doing anything too extravagant just yet, and we don't need to. So the knees are the bones, your shoulder blades, they come in right there. So these come in like that, go down like this, they flow into these muscles like so. Okay, just get that like so. And I'm gonna some more definition in the deltoids here. Here. We're not worrying about making everything look crispy right now. We're just getting the basic shape. Always keep that in mind. Do not try to go into too much detail at the beginning, because then your sculpt will feel rushed and it'll come out looking funny because you didn't take enough time planning it out first. Another thing I want to do is hold control, go in here. Alright, and I'm also still with clay strips. I haven't changed my brush yet. We're only going to be using a few of these brushes. We're going to use clay strips, crease, probably flatten, maybe. We're most certainly going to use grab, smooth, and pinch. And that's pretty much it. We really don't need to use any other sculpt tools. Just keep that in mind. So, just going to come in here, make the chest a bit bigger. And the reason I'm sculpting in perspective mode rather than orthographic mode is because you can get a cool looking result in orthographic mode. However, orthographic mode is not a true representation of what your mesh will be when you start animating. Once you animate it, it'll look more like this than this. This is a flat representation of what's going on. Like, you see this hand, it's in front of me, but it's not, because perspective isn't turned on, this hand is still the same size as this hand. However, if I hit 5, now you see, because this hand is in front of me and it's in front of my eyes more, this hand appears bigger than this hand. It's like real life perspective. That's why it's called perspective mode. So, we're going to continue sculpting. Laying out everything nicely. Just click and drag, and you can make something really cool, and you don't even need anything fancy. All you need is an imagination, some reference images, and a mouse. You can make some cool stuff. Okay, so I'm going to start coming in here in the arm area. Zoom in a bit closer. So I'm going to start making this part of the muscle, part of the arm, like so. And I'm going to make this bottom part also come in. This out here, make the elbow. And now if you want more, if you want your brush to affect the mesh more, you can always turn up the power here. Let me just unlock this. Always turn up the power like so, and then you see we have a stronger effect of the brush. It's a bit too strong for me. Just turn that back down. So we don't need all that strength right now. We're just laying out the basic detail. You turn up the strength when you start doing finer details, because since finer details are just that, they're fine details. With your brush set at a low setting, it's hard to get the details to show up. So you turn it up to increase the effectiveness of your fine details. Okay. So this is the point where I want to use the grab brush. So in order to use the grab brush, just hit the letter G, and that'll give you the grab brush. Now, I've been working with the same size brush for a minute. I haven't needed to change the size of it. So in order to change the size of your brush, just hit F, the letter F on the keyboard, and you can change the size of your brush. So I'm going to make it a bit bigger. I'm going to come here and just going to click and drag on the parts that I don't want or the parts that I just want to edit, and I just want to make that less obvious, and I want to make this a bit more obvious. I want this to show up behind that. It's my stylized look that I like to go for when I'm making these characters. Have really, really large triceps to get the arm looking real muscular. Even though he's on a skinny character, it's still cool to have, in my opinion. You know. And another reason we're doing this in perspective mode is to get just to make sure that we can get our proportions, you know, a bit comic booky and cartoony without it looking too distorted or forced or too unnatural. You don't want it to look too unnatural, but you do want it to look kind of cool. So in order to change it back to clay strips, just go and click clay strips, because they don't have well, they do have a keyboard shortcut for clay strips, but it's a bit hard to memorize, and I didn't memorize it, so I just I just go back and click it. They have one for clay. You know, if you hit C, that's clay, but they don't have like I would prefer Shift C or something like that to be clay strips. Shift C is actually crease. You know, if they could make Control C clay strips, that'd be cool, but you know, they didn't, and that sucks, because they suck, but it's alright. So I'm going to continue. Okay. Getting this down pat a little bit. Let's come back here. There's not much detail happening over here. Let's just sculpt over that and smooth it out so that we can get some going. Smooth this part out, because the elbow needs to be the only strong protruding part of this operation here. Alright. Okay. We can't neglect under the arm, because that is important also. The arm just kind of goes over that muscle like that. Okay. I'll go in with the crease brush and fix that later. Hit G for the grab brush, and we're going to go in and fix some of that. Bring that back down. Bring this back up. Like so. Okay. So, that will be it for this part. In the next part, we're going to continue sculpting. We're going to add a bit more detail in the next part. We're going to start start defining a lot of these shapes that we've made in here. So, you know, keep practicing if you're having trouble. You know, you can always go to a different Blender file and practice on a blank canvas so that you can get the hang of it. But like I said before, this tutorial is not for beginners. But if you're if you've had a little experience but you still wanted to know how to make a character, you can follow along. So that'll be it for this tutorial, and I will see you all in the next part. See you then.